Let me introduce myself. I'm Pete Ray. I'm an ordained Unity minister. I was ordained in 1967, and I was the minister at the Unity Spiritual Center here in Bellingham, Washington, for a number of years. And now, on with the lesson. Welcome to Unity Spiritual Center, located in Bellingham, Washington. If you would like more information about the Unity Spiritual Center, please go to www.unitybellingham.org. On the home page at the Unity Center of Bellingham, you'll find these words. We are a spiritual center committed to nourishing joyful lives through positive thoughts, words, and actions. Now, this statement is especially appropriate for what I'd like to do today, which is to share some thoughts with you about words. Words took on a real level of importance for me and in my life personally when I was a very young child. I had an epiphany, probably in the second or third grade, and I realized that, well, first of all, I realized that my mother and stepfather were living their lives primarily by words from old sayings. And I put up with it for quite some time, but when it really opened up for me was I came home one day and I told them that I was having some trouble with a young man at school and that I thought there might be a disturbance at school and therefore they might have to come up to the school to make things a little bit better. And they questioned me about this, and then they presented me with the following old saying. Now, many of you probably have heard this in your own life. They said to me, and as I remember the experience, they actually said it. It was almost as if it were choreographed. And they said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Now, I got to tell you, when I heard that, I had two thoughts. And the first one was, and it's not very pleasant entirely, but it was, "Are you crazy?" And the second one was, "What are you thinking?" At that point, I became very interested in words because I realized that words did hurt me. I didn't know that they didn't hurt anybody else, but they certainly did hurt me. So I had to deal with that, and I have been interested in words ever since. Now, I'd like us to consider words from three fundamental perspectives. One, the first perspective is the spiritual perspective. Now, the reason for that perspective is that we are in the context of a church. We're here in a church. We're talking about spiritual things, and so we need to have some kind of a tie to a spiritual aspect of this subject. The second part of this talk will be about the nature and purpose of words. And finally, a third section, a third perspective, will be on the practical applications for applying what we've learned or thought about in the first two perspectives. So let's consider the spiritual aspect first. Now, you don't have to go very far into the Bible in order to encounter this idea of words. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is open the book up and you'll begin in Genesis 1, and you make a very interesting discovery. Now, I'm not going to try to turn everybody, all of us, into a Hebrew Bible master scholar, but I am going to give you, I'd like to give you a simple question that will help you to deal with much of the material in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as Christians refer to it. There's a simple question, and it's this: what part did God play in whatever is happening at the moment? Now, Genesis 1 presents a creation story that has a very interesting background, and it is really, really full of incredibly good material, most of which we're going to be unable to unpack this morning, but we'll get enough. Hopefully you'll get some interest in it, and there'll be a website come up, and it will come up in the, you can check the description field in the YouTube video, and there will be links in that field, and you can then go to these various sites to confirm what some of the things I'm saying might be true. So I'd really appreciate it if you do that. One of the reasons is that I'm going to be saying some things that are extremely counterintuitive. So we'll see how that works. And as I said, I'll give you some websites that you can then go and see some of this material. In the Hebrew Bible, it begins, this first creation story takes up the entire first chapter of Genesis and the first couple of verses of the second chapter. Now, in this story of creation, the story begins with these words, and God began to create. And then it says, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the deep. Now, I got to tell you, there have been times in my life when I have felt like that's exactly what life was about. Life seemed formless and void. There was this huge void, and oddly enough, the actual translation of those words comes closer to God was confronted with chaos. Utter chaos. Everything was in chaos. There was no form. There was nothing going on other than this chaos. Utter chaos. Now, it then says that God proceeded to create by using words. God creates with the words. As a matter of fact, this first chapter of Genesis, the first 6 days of creation, God uses words to create things, and then it lays out very clearly for us a plan and how to be creative. Because in one of those days it says we are made in the image and likeness of God, so it would only make sense that we can also be creative in our lives. Now we'll come back to that first chapter of Genesis and how to be creative with that plan that God used in the final section of this lesson, where we're going to talk about practical applications. Now, Jesus also used words. As a matter of fact, that's pretty much the primary tool that he used. He was like the rest of us, as we will see momentarily. But he used words to speak to people. And I want to share with you, in the 13th chapter of Matthew, there is a parable called the parable of the sower. Now, the reason it's important is that Jesus talks about seeds. Now, he's not giving an agricultural lesson. He's talking about seeds that are words. And these words, he says, fall on different levels of consciousness, and that those levels of consciousness are, in his words, the ground that the seeds fall on, the kind of ground they fall on, and as a result, how do they grow and how do they produce? Now, that's the 13th chapter of Matthew, and interestingly enough, in that chapter, it's about the only one of his parables where Jesus actually himself gives an explanation. So it makes it very curious and very interesting to hear his explanation of it, his interpretation, if you will. He gives a metaphysical interpretation, is what he does. And if you're interested in that, and I am, I want to know what his words were about. And he tells you very clearly. Now, the second perspective that I want us to take on in terms of words is the nature and purpose of words. Now, the nature of words present themselves in at least three ways. First, words are something that we use to think with. Now, I've had people say to me, "Oh, but Pete, I like to think with pictures." I'll grant you, you can think with pictures, but tell me about your pictures. Tell me what are in your pictures. Because I'll guarantee you everything in your picture has a word. And so you're thinking in words. Yes, most of us think in words, and there's no problem with that. So there's this internal thinking with words. That is, words that we actually don't speak out loud. Words that we think and which hopefully remain with us alone. Because there's a lot of words and a lot of times that people are thinking. You don't want to know what they're thinking. You wouldn't want that appearing on the screen in front of you. You don't want to hear that. Now, then there are spoken words. And those words are the words that come forth from us. And finally, there's the printed word. And it has a lot of subcategories: magazines, books. The internet is full of words. Just about any place you turn has a lot of words associated with it. So you got three kinds of words: internal, external, and written, or in some way printed. Now, what actually happens when we think that we're speaking words and hearing them? Now, this is extremely important. I know this seems somewhat trivial, but the fact is it's an unbelievable process. And it's just truly amazing that we are able to use words as we do. What actually happens? Now, I want to share something with you, and I want it word for word. So I'm going to quote this to you. Again, this is one of those places where it's extremely counterintuitive. When you hear someone speak, sound waves activate sensory neurons in your inner ear. And these neurons pass information to areas of the brain where different aspects of the sound are extracted and interpreted. And at the same time, the sounds that are going on around you that are not important to those words, the brain actually moves them off to the side and gives you, hopefully, a clear hearing and understanding of what the person has said in words. You don't but it happens so quickly that you don't actually speak words. You think you're speaking words. As a matter of fact, if I watch you speak, I can see your lips moving. And you're pretty much in sync. I don't know if you've ever been watching a video and had it be out of sync. There's nothing any more distracting than having a video where the words are out of sync with what's going on with the person's lips. All right. So you think you think words are coming out of your mouth, and the person receiving them thinks words are coming into their ears, and that's it. But it's not. In fact, all that's happening is sound waves are being activated. And those sound waves are picked up, and it's fascinating. One of the links that I've shared with you will tell you about your ear, all of the incredible things that are happening inside your ears. It's phenomenal what's going on in there. And then, not only that, then it has to pass those waves to areas of the brain. And the brain does amazing things, and it does them instantly. Now, for those of you who are worried about artificial intelligence and computers outrunning us and taking over, I'm not quite so sure. Our brains are phenomenal. They work at an incredible speed. And you got to be aware of that, because this process, it's like, how in the world does this happen? How do we understand, how do we hear these sound waves and then turn them into anything that represents a word, or even a series of words that represent a thought? It's almost like, for me, this revelation was like observing automobiles on the highway. What happens when we go out there on the highway? You know what amazes me is, when we go out on the highway every day, we're taking our lives in our hands. It's a wonder that we aren't all involved in automobile accidents. The way people drive, it's a wonder we aren't all involved in automobile accidents every time we go out. It's phenomenal, the fact that we stay out of accidents. The fact that these words, these sound waves, are getting converted like that almost instantly just really impressed me. How many words do we speak? How many words do you think? Just think of thought. Think to yourself, give yourself a number of words that you think the average person speaks during a day. Now you get and hang on to your seats, because some interesting things are going to come out. In 2006, a woman named Luann Brizendine published a book, and the title of the book was The Female Brain. Now, Ms. Brizendine didn't have any, this is 2006, didn't have any real scientific evidence for this, because there hadn't been any studies about how many words people actually speak. That is, scientific studies that could be counted on to say that, yeah, we actually counted the words. So she came up with a guesstimate. Now, the guesstimate that she gave, curiously enough, was based on a female stereotype that I suspect has been going on since the beginning of speech. And that is that women talk a lot more than men. That's the stereotype. That's what people thought. And so Ms. Brizendine said that she thought that women spoke about 20,000 words a day and men spoke about 7,000. Now we're going to see how far from the truth that turns out to be. Later on, several years later, and it's only very recently, there has been a growth in technology for actually measuring or counting the words that people say. This study was done at the University of Arizona, and they really started this. And they did the study with people, and they did it with several hundred people so that they had a good cross-section. And they did it with both males and females. And what they found, curiously enough, was not that women spoke 20,000 words a day and men 7,000, but rather that both genders spoke almost exactly the same. They spoke 16,000 words a day on average. Now you're probably thinking to yourself right now, I got to get busy. If I'm gonna come anywhere near the average, I better get with the program here. But not to worry, because that would only be, if you spoke 16,000 words a day, that would come out to something like 5,840,000 words per year. So you'd better really get with it if you want to catch up here. Now, with all those words going out, the next question that I had about the nature of words is, how much do people actually remember? And it turns out that most people at best can remember about 17 to 25%. That is, when we're functioning at our peak maximum level, we're probably getting about a quarter or 25% of what's being said to us, of the words that are actually being said to us. Now, probably shows that we need to learn to listen. Not just hear, but learning to listen as well as hearing. Now, I'm going to give you some research that you're probably going to, again, find a little counterintuitive. So I've included a website that is extremely well known, which is WebMD. You can go there and check this out. Their research has shown that, God, I hate to say this, men use half their brain when they're listening. I know, this is impossible. And at the same time, their research showed that both lobes of the brain are used by women when they listen. So if you're wondering, maybe my spouse or my significant other is tuning me out, he probably is, because he's only using half his brain. But it's okay. It'll work. Trust me. Now, that's the nature of words. What about the purpose of words? The purpose of words is to communicate our thoughts and feelings to other people. Now, here's a real kicker for us to understanding this whole business of people speaking, my listening, and then speaking back to them. Thoughts and feelings are communicated. About 7% of what we want to communicate comes through the actual words that we say. 7% through the words we say. 93% comes through our tone of voice and our facial expressions. That's where people are picking it up. And this has just been fascinating to me to watch people closely as they're talking, because I know now I'm listening not only to their words, but to their facial expressions and to their tone of voice. Okay, now to the practical applications. This is what's going to be really important. When we look at words in terms of dealing with life, we're looking at something called labels. That is, most of what we do in terms of using our words is to place labels on things. Now, labels help us to navigate our world. And as such, in my opinion, labels are essential. Now, I've heard great spiritual teachers say, if we just dropped all labels, everything would be fine. Nobody would have a label on them. Well, that could work, but if I'm looking for the men's room, I may want to find it. And that label that's on the door can help me. And that is a significant improvement of having to wander into the wrong one. Now, what we're looking for in labels is, what kind of labels do we put on ourselves? And what kind of labels do we put on each other? This is what's really important, because labels can create expectations. And what we find then is that many of our personal relationships, we're not dealing with the person or the circumstances at the time. We're dealing with our expectations from the labels that we've placed on that person or that circumstance. And this is extremely important to realize. I may be having a conversation, but I am having it with my expectations about you if I'm not careful. So it's very important to back that down a little bit and realize I want to be present with you, and regardless of the labels I may have put on you in the past or may have put on myself, I'd like to be present for you and with you now, the way things are. Labels are often a control or an attempt to control or manage uncertainty. And they can do that to some degree, but they also can create negative expectations. So we need to learn to observe the labels that people put on things, that we put on ourselves, that we put on others, and what others put on other things. One of the ways that I've found to get in touch with this labeling is to look at euphemisms. Now, if I'm going to do something, I want it to be fun, and I want to have some level of enjoyment about it. And for me, euphemisms have proved to be an absolutely fascinating way to deal with this. So you might start looking around at the various euphemisms people use. For instance, if you were to ask somebody, they might say, well, I'm between jobs. Well, I mean, that beats the heck out of being fired or let go. So I'm between jobs. Yeah, that's a euphemism. And vintage or senior, or as some of us have discovered, our dentist actually says to us, people of your demographic, when he meant old. I loved that. We had a really good time exploring his use of that euphemism. I got to tell you this story about euphemisms, and this one really hit home for me. It happened a number of years ago. Actually, it happened in the late 60s. And a young woman, I was the minister of the Unity Church in Fresno, California, and a young woman was coming to the church, and she and I were working together on some issues. And she showed up one time at the Women of Unity meeting. Now, we had a very large Women of Unity group, and she happened to show up on that day, so I took her in there and was introducing her around. The women naturally invited her to stay and have lunch with them, so she did. And during the lunch, one of the women said to her, "What do you do?" And the young lady said, "Oh, I've been hanging paper." And the women all, "Oh, okay," and went right on. After the lunch, and after the young lady had left, one of the women said to me, or asked me the question, she said, "She seems so small to be a paper hanger." And I told the woman, I said, "Look, that was a euphemism. What she meant was she was writing bad checks. That's what it meant to hang paper at that time." And these people were all in shock because that euphemism was so far from what they were thinking. Now let's go back to that first chapter of Genesis and how God uses this whole planning of creation and instituting it. God creates in three basic steps. First of all, God creates God says, "Let there be," and there is. The second step, God separates. Now, interestingly enough, well, let's just take the first creation. God separates the light from the darkness. Now, it doesn't say that light is good and darkness is bad. It simply says God then looked at the separation, the light and the darkness, and said, they are both good. They're good and very good. 3 steps to creation. If we're made in the image and likeness of God, we should be able to use these same steps. Now, I have found that by tweaking my affirmations, and affirmations are a big part of what Unity has to teach, and that is an affirmation such as, "I am happy and filled with joy." Now, a part of my mind says to me, are you serious? You're happy? You're filled with joy? Why are you saying that? I can see all of the reasons why I'm not. and I respond with a negative aspect. God doesn't say this. God says, and be very, very careful and listen very carefully to what God says. God says, let there be. And I got to say, when I have changed that, tweaked that affirmation to let there be joy and happiness in my life, I have found that I then begin to observe it. And when I see it, I can see the difference between the joy and the not so joyful. And I can pronounce that joy and happiness as good and very good. Now, I know some people say that, well, you get on up in years, how are you going to make any kind of a difference in life? I want to share with you, to close this out, I want to share with you a change in wording and how it changed our world. And you can see that you could have done this just as easily as anyone else. For a very long time, when we, humans and pre-humans or whatever, were starting to evolve, we had to ask ourselves the question, how do we get us to water? Because we have to have water. So how do we get us to water? And for literally tens of thousands of years, people asked that same question. And they always came up with essentially the same answer. We got to move. If the water moves, we have to move. And then one day, somebody made a slight change. Didn't change a word, didn't substitute a word, but made a slight change in the order of those same words. And they came up with the question, how do we get water to us? Makes a huge difference. How do we get us to water, and how do we get water to us? And it changed the world, literally changed the world. Now, we don't know. We can't affix a name to who did that. But I will guarantee you that you can make changes in life as you and I make changes in our words. I want to take a few moments to encourage you to support Unity Spiritual Center, located in Bellingham, Washington. You can send a check by sending it to the address in the credits on this YouTube video. Or you can go to the Unity Bellingham website, and you will find on the home page a donate button, and you can donate by either a credit card or by PayPal on that page. And we would very much appreciate your sharing, your caring, and your giving.